The rain had already started by the time Eleanor Hayes signed the divorce papers. Gray clouds covered the city, and the grand Moretti estate felt strangely quiet, as if even the walls understood that something precious was ending. Eleanor sat across from the family attorney, a simple fountain pen resting between her fingers. It was the same pen Adrian had given her on their first wedding anniversary, engraved with the words, "For the stories we'll write together." She traced the faded letters for one brief moment before lowering the pen to the final page. Her signature came easily, elegant and steady, without hesitation or anger. 5 years of marriage ended with a single line of ink. The attorney gathered the documents carefully and lowered his voice. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Moretti." Eleanor looked toward the rain beyond the tall windows, a faint smile touching her lips. "Not anymore," she answered softly. "My name is Eleanor Hayes." She stood, slipped her wedding ring from her finger, and held it in her palm for a few seconds. It was nothing extravagant, just a simple gold band she had insisted on choosing herself. Adrian could have bought the largest diamond in the world, but she had always believed love should never be measured by price. She placed the ring gently beside the signed papers, picked up one small leather suitcase, and walked toward the front door. She left behind expensive dresses, priceless paintings, shelves of books they had collected together, and every luxury the mansion could offer. None of those things mattered anymore. As the doors opened, cool rain drifted inside. Eleanor paused for one last look at the home where she had spent 5 years believing patience could soften even the hardest heart. She did not cry. She did not ask anyone to stop her. She simply stepped into the rain and disappeared beyond the gates without looking back. Across the city, Adrian Moretti was finishing a meeting inside the headquarters of his family business. Every person around the conference table watched him with quiet respect. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, Adrian carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who had spent his entire life making impossible decisions. A dark tattoo disappeared beneath the collar of his crisp white shirt, the only visible reminder that behind the polished businessman stood someone whose name inspired both loyalty and fear. He never raised his voice because he never needed to. One sentence from Adrian could settle an argument. One glance could silence an entire room. While executives discussed investments and legal contracts, his assistant entered quietly and leaned close enough that only Adrian could hear. "Sir, Mrs. Moretti signed the divorce papers." Adrian paused for barely a second before closing the folder in front of him. "Understood," he replied. His voice remained perfectly even. "Continue." The meeting moved forward as if nothing had happened. Numbers filled the screen. Lawyers spoke about acquisitions. Advisors debated expansion plans. Adrian answered every question with his usual precision, but for reasons he could not explain, he found himself staring through the conference room windows instead of at the financial reports. He had expected this day for months. The distance between him and Eleanor had grown so quietly that neither of them had ever admitted when the silence became permanent. He told himself the divorce was practical, inevitable, perhaps even necessary. Yet somewhere beneath years of discipline, something felt unexpectedly hollow. By the time Adrian returned home that evening, the mansion felt unfamiliar. The staff greeted him politely, but no one smiled the way they usually did when Eleanor was there. She had always remembered birthdays, asked about their families, and somehow made the enormous house feel warm despite its marble floors and endless hallways. Adrian loosened his tie as he climbed the staircase. Small absences greeted him everywhere. Fresh flowers no longer stood on the dining table because Eleanor had always arranged them herself. The faint scent of lavender that lingered outside their bedroom had disappeared. Half the closet stood empty. The novel she loved had vanished from the bedside table. Their framed anniversary photograph was gone. Only one small ceramic bird remained where she had left it years ago, after making it during a charity art class. Adrian picked it up and remembered laughing because it had been slightly crooked. Eleanor had smiled and said, "So are people," he had answered without thinking. "I love it anyway." The memory lingered far longer than he expected. He carefully returned the little bird to exactly the same place before an elderly butler appeared in the doorway. "Sir, Mr. Carter is here." Adrian frowned. "At this hour?" The butler nodded. "He says it cannot wait." A few moments later, Samuel Carter entered the study carrying an old leather portfolio. The family attorney looked unusually serious, even by his normally reserved standards. Adrian gestured toward a chair. "My father has been gone for nearly a year. What could possibly be so urgent now? Samuel slowly opened the portfolio and removed a single sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, and a dark red wax seal remained perfectly intact. Adrian immediately recognized the handwriting across the front. It belonged to his father. 4 simple words beneath his name made his heart tighten before he fully understood why. Open only after Eleanor leaves. Adrian stared at the envelope without speaking. His father had always chosen every word carefully. Nothing he wrote was accidental. When did he leave this? Adrian finally asked. Several weeks before his passing, Samuel answered. Why wasn't I given it then? Because those were his instructions. Adrian looked from the envelope to the attorney. You've kept this for an entire year. Samuel nodded. He believed there would come a day when Eleanor would leave this house, and he insisted, I wait until that day arrived. Adrian felt a strange chill despite the warmth of the room. He knew my marriage would end. Samuel hesitated before answering. He believed this letter should only be read after her departure. He never explained why. Adrian took the envelope into his hands. It felt heavier than paper should. His thumb rested against the edge of the wax seal while countless questions crowded his mind. Why had his father connected this letter to Eleanor? Why had he waited until after the divorce? What truth could possibly matter now that she was gone? Samuel quietly rose from his chair. I've fulfilled my promise. Adrian looked up. Do you know what's inside? The attorney shook his head. No, your father sealed it himself. No one has opened it since. After Samuel left, silence settled over the study. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while the old grandfather clock counted each passing second. Adrian remained alone, staring at the envelope. Across the room, the empty side of the bookshelf where Eleanor's favorite novels had once stood caught his attention. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, he wondered whether there had been something he had failed to see, something hidden beneath her quiet acceptance. She had never argued, never begged him to stay, never defended herself against the growing distance between them. She had simply walked away. Adrian looked down once more at his father's unmistakable handwriting. Open only after Eleanor leaves. Taking a slow breath, he reached for the letter opener and carefully broke the aged wax seal. Before he unfolded the first page, something slipped from inside the envelope and fell face down onto the desk, leaving Adrian frozen as he reached to turn it over. Adrian slowly turned the photograph over, expecting to find an old family portrait or another legal document, but instead he found a faded picture of himself standing beside Eleanor. On the day they had signed their private marriage contract 5 years earlier, they were not wearing expensive wedding clothes. Adrian had on a dark suit after leaving a business meeting, while Eleanor wore a simple ivory dress she had bought herself because she believed a marriage should begin with sincerity instead of extravagance. They were smiling at each other, not at the camera. Tucked behind the photograph was a single handwritten note from Adrian's late father. If you are looking at this picture, then you have already lost something far more valuable than your pride. Read the letter only after you remember how this marriage truly began. Adrian lowered the note without opening the sealed pages beneath it. His father had always believed that memories revealed truth better than arguments. Against his own expectations, Adrian found himself drifting back to the afternoon he first met Eleanor Hayes. 5 years earlier, the Moretti Foundation had organized a literacy fundraiser at a neighborhood library scheduled for demolition. Adrian attended only because his father insisted that public generosity strengthened private influence. He expected speeches, photographers, and endless conversations with donors. Instead, he noticed a young literature teacher sitting on the floor with a circle of children, reading a novel aloud with such warmth that even the restless ones listened without moving. She never looked toward the cameras or the wealthy guests entering the building. Her attention belonged entirely to the children surrounding her. When the reading session ended, one little boy tugged at Adrian's expensive jacket and whispered, "Miss Eleanor says stories make people brave." Adrian had looked across the room, meeting Eleanor's eyes for the first time. She smiled politely before returning to collect scattered books from the floor. She had no idea who he was, and strangely, that felt refreshing. Most people recognized the Moretti name immediately and either tried to impress him or avoided him altogether. Eleanor did neither. A few days later, Adrian's father invited her to oversee an educational program funded by the family's charitable foundation. She accepted on one condition: every dollar promised to the children had to reach them. No unnecessary ceremonies, no publicity campaign, no photographs featuring donors. Adrian remembered watching her challenge the foundation's board without the slightest hint of fear. She spoke calmly, but every word carried conviction. His father laughed afterward and quietly said, "That young woman values integrity more than comfort. Don't forget that." Adrian had not forgotten. In fact, he found himself creating reasons to visit the foundation office more often than necessary. Sometimes he brought financial reports that could easily have been delivered by email. Sometimes he simply walked through the building after meetings, pretending to inspect renovations while hoping to catch another glimpse of Eleanor organizing books or speaking with volunteers. She treated him no differently than anyone else. She thanked him when he helped carry heavy boxes. She corrected his grammar once after noticing a mistake in a speech he planned to give. She even laughed when he admitted he had never finished reading the classic novel she recommended. For the first time in years, Adrian discovered that silence beside another person did not always feel uncomfortable. Months passed before he finally asked her to dinner. Eleanor hesitated long enough that Adrian almost withdrew the invitation. "I don't belong in your world," she admitted. Adrian answered honestly. "Neither do I most days." That unexpected confession earned him her first genuine smile. Their relationship grew quietly, far from gossip columns and public attention. Eleanor never cared about luxury. She preferred bookstores over expensive parties, quiet walks over glamorous vacations, handwritten notes over extravagant gifts. Adrian often found small messages tucked inside files on his desk. "Don't forget to eat lunch. The meeting will still be there after you've had some sleep. You smile more when you aren't trying so hard not to." He never replied with notes of his own, yet he kept every one of them inside the top drawer of his desk. When Adrian proposed, there were no reporters, no orchestra, and no grand celebration. He simply took her to the botanical garden where they had shared their first honest conversation. Holding a plain gold ring, he asked, "Will you stay with me?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment before answering, "Only if you promise we'll never stop telling each other the truth." Adrian smiled and said, "I promise." His father attended their small private ceremony, along with only a handful of trusted witnesses. Before leaving that evening, the older man quietly pulled Eleanor aside. Adrian watched from a distance as his father placed a sealed envelope into her hands. She looked surprised. His father spoke so softly that Adrian heard only one sentence. "There may come a day when he needs this more than he needs me." Eleanor slipped the envelope into her handbag without opening it. When Adrian later asked what his father had given her, she simply smiled and replied, "Something he asked me to protect." Adrian accepted the answer because he trusted both of them completely. At least he believed he did. Looking back now, sitting alone in the silent study, he realized that had been the first secret to enter their marriage. It had seemed harmless then, almost insignificant compared with the happiness they shared during those early years. Yet as time passed, other small mysteries appeared. Eleanor occasionally received phone calls she never discussed. She sometimes visited Adrian's father without mentioning the reason. On several evenings she returned home looking emotionally exhausted, insisting everything was fine. Adrian never pressed for answers because he assumed she would tell him when she was ready. Then his father's health began to fail, business pressures intensified, and Victor Moretti slowly became a more visible presence inside the family organization. Adrian remembered Victor making an offhand remark during one family dinner, smiling as though it meant nothing. "It's strange how Uncle trusts Eleanor with things even you don't know." Adrian had laughed at the comment that night, but the words lingered long after the conversation ended. They became the first tiny crack in a marriage built on quiet promises instead of suspicion. Sitting at his desk in the present, Adrian looked once more at the photograph resting beside the unopened letter. In the picture, Eleanor was smiling at him with complete trust, unaware of everything that would eventually stand between them. His father's note lay beside it, its message echoing through the empty room. "Remember how this marriage truly began." Adrian closed his eyes, trying to hold on to those happier memories, unaware that they were only the beginning of a far more painful truth waiting inside the letter he still had not read. Adrian finally unfolded the letter, expecting immediate answers, but instead he found only the first page, where his father's familiar handwriting instructed him to stop reading until he understood how easily trust could be replaced by doubt. The remaining pages were folded together beneath a ribbon, untouched for nearly a year. Frustrated, Adrian set them aside and found himself pulled back into memories he had spent months trying to bury. The first year of his marriage with Eleanor had been unexpectedly peaceful. She transformed the enormous Moretti estate without changing its appearance. She remembered the names of every employee, insisted that birthdays be celebrated, filled quiet rooms with fresh flowers and music, and somehow convinced Adrian to eat dinner before midnight more often than not. She never tried to change who he was. Instead, she quietly softened the sharp edges of a life built on constant responsibility. Adrian rarely spoke about his worries, but Eleanor learned to recognize them anyway. She could tell by the way he loosened his tie after difficult meetings, or by how long he stood looking out the library windows before speaking. Sometimes she simply placed a cup of coffee beside him without saying a word. Other times she rested a hand lightly on his shoulder and whispered, "You're home now." Those 3 words became the safest place Adrian had ever known, though he never admitted it aloud. As the months passed, however, the pressure surrounding the Moretti family business intensified. Adrian's late father gradually stepped back from daily operations as his health declined, leaving Adrian responsible for increasingly complex negotiations. During that same period, Victor Moretti became indispensable, or so it appeared. Charismatic, polished, and endlessly helpful in public, Victor volunteered to oversee departments Adrian no longer had time to supervise. He stayed late at the office, anticipated problems before they reached Adrian's desk, and earned praise from board members who admired his apparent loyalty. Adrian believed he had finally found a dependable partner within the family. Eleanor was less convinced. She never openly criticized Victor, but Adrian noticed the subtle changes whenever his cousin visited the estate. Her smile became more careful. Conversations grew shorter. Once, after Victor left following a family dinner, Eleanor quietly asked, "How well do you really know him?" Adrian looked up from the reports spread across the dining table. "We've grown up together." Eleanor hesitated. "That wasn't my question." Adrian laughed gently, assuming she was simply being cautious. "Victor can be ambitious, but he's family." Eleanor did not argue. She only nodded and began clearing the dishes. Looking back now, Adrian realized she had ended many conversations that way, not because she had nothing to say, but because she sensed he was not ready to hear it. Weeks later, Victor arrived unexpectedly at Adrian's office carrying several financial statements. He placed them on the desk with an expression that suggested genuine concern. "I wasn't sure whether to bring this up," he began carefully. Adrian glanced through the reports without noticing anything unusual. "Bring what up?" Victor remained silent for a moment before speaking. "There have been several transfers from one of the charitable accounts." Adrian frowned. "The foundation." Victor nodded. "The paperwork is properly signed. I just thought you should know Eleanor approved them personally." Adrian reviewed the documents more closely. Every transfer supported educational programs and community projects that matched the foundation's mission. Nothing appeared illegal or suspicious. "What's the problem?" he asked. Victor leaned back in his chair. "Maybe there isn't one. I just found it strange that she never mentioned moving such large amounts of money." Adrian closed the file. "She manages the foundation. I trust her judgment." Victor smiled. "Of course. I only wanted you to have all the information." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it planted a question Adrian had never considered before. Why hadn't Eleanor mentioned the transfers? That evening he casually asked about the foundation during dinner. Eleanor answered every question openly, explaining that several schools had received emergency funding after unexpected budget cuts. Adrian listened, satisfied with her explanation, but he couldn't ignore one detail. She never mentioned meeting privately with his father to approve those decisions. It was a small omission, hardly worth discussing, yet Victor's earlier comments quietly echoed in the back of his mind. Over the following months, similar moments accumulated. Adrian would arrive home to learn. Eleanor had spent the afternoon visiting his father without explanation. Victor would casually mention seeing her leaving the law office with Samuel Carter. Adrian would discover that Eleanor had received another handwritten letter from his father but had tucked it away without discussing it. None of these events proved anything. Separately, they meant almost nothing. Together, they formed a pattern Adrian couldn't fully understand. Eleanor noticed the change before he did. She sensed the hesitation in his questions and the longer silences between them. One rainy evening she found him standing alone in the library, staring out the window exactly as he often did after difficult meetings. "You're thinking too much again," she said softly. Adrian smiled, but it failed to reach his eyes. "Occupational hazard." She stepped beside him. "Then let me carry some of it." For a moment Adrian almost told her everything. He almost admitted that small doubts had begun creeping into his thoughts. Doubts he hated himself for entertaining. Instead, he simply kissed her forehead and answered, "There's nothing to worry about." Eleanor searched his face as though waiting for something more. But when nothing came, she quietly accepted his answer. She had promised never to force honesty from someone who wasn't ready to give it. Victor, meanwhile, continued building his influence with remarkable patience. He never accused Eleanor directly. He simply offered carefully chosen observations. "Funny coincidence. Perhaps I'm mistaken. It's probably nothing." Each remark sounded harmless, making Adrian believe every conclusion belonged to him alone. The most damaging moment arrived several weeks later, during a board meeting, when Victor entered carrying a sealed folder. "These were delivered anonymously this morning," he said. Inside were photocopies of private correspondence suggesting someone within the foundation had been sharing confidential financial information. None of the pages contained Eleanor's name. Yet several meetings listed in the documents matched dates when she had visited Samuel Carter or Adrian's father. Adrian stared at the papers, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with the woman he knew. Before he could speak, Victor quietly added, "I'm not saying Eleanor did anything wrong. I'm saying someone wants it to look that way." It was the perfect sentence because it sounded like a defense while accomplishing the opposite. Adrian left the meeting carrying questions he could no longer silence. That night he found Eleanor asleep on the living room sofa with an open novel resting against her chest. A reading lamp cast warm light across her peaceful face, making her seem impossibly far from the suspicion growing inside him. On the coffee table sat a small envelope addressed in his father's handwriting. Adrian reached toward it, then stopped himself. He could have opened it. He could have asked her about it. Instead, he quietly turned off the lamp, covered her with a blanket, and walked upstairs carrying nothing except the uncomfortable feeling that the distance between them had taken another invisible step. Neither of them realized that someone else had been carefully measuring every one of those steps from the very beginning. The distance between Adrian and Eleanor did not appear overnight. It settled into their marriage the way dust settles over forgotten books, so gradually that neither of them noticed until everything felt different. Adrian became quieter at home, answering questions with polite smiles instead of honest conversations. Eleanor tried to believe the pressure of leading the Moretti family business was simply exhausting him, yet she could no longer ignore the way he studied her whenever she returned from visiting his father or meeting Samuel Carter. His eyes had once looked at her with certainty. Now they searched for explanations she did not understand. She wanted to ask what had changed, but every time she gathered the courage, another urgent meeting interrupted them, or Adrian convinced her that everything was fine. He was trying to protect her from his growing doubts. She was trying to protect him from a truth she had promised never to reveal. Neither realized that silence had become Victor's strongest ally. One afternoon, Eleanor received another message from Adrian's father asking her to visit him privately. His illness had grown worse, and each meeting left him looking weaker than before. When she arrived, he handed her a sealed folder tied with a dark ribbon. His hands trembled as he placed it in hers. "You must keep this hidden," he told her quietly, "not because Adrian doesn't deserve the truth, but because he isn't ready to see it yet." Eleanor frowned with concern. "How long do I keep this?" The older man looked toward the window before answering. "Until the day comes when protecting him means letting him hate you," the words chilled her. "I don't understand," he offered a tired smile. "I pray you never will." She left carrying the folder inside her handbag, her heart heavier than when she had arrived. Unbeknownst to her, Victor was parked across the street. From a distance, he watched her leave the house with the folder clutched tightly against her side. He smiled to himself, not because he knew what was inside, but because appearances often mattered more than facts. By the following morning, anonymous photographs showing Eleanor leaving Adrian's father's home carrying confidential documents had found their way onto Adrian's desk. They were accompanied by a typed note containing only one sentence: "Some secrets aren't meant to protect you." Adrian stared at the photographs for a long time. He wanted to dismiss them immediately, but they matched the quiet questions that had been accumulating for months. Before he could decide what to believe, Victor knocked gently on the office door. "You look troubled," he observed. Adrian slid the photographs across the desk. Victor glanced at them with carefully rehearsed surprise. "Where did these come from?" Adrian shook his head. "No return address." Victor remained silent for several seconds before speaking cautiously. "Maybe you should ask Eleanor." Adrian nodded. "I will." That evening he returned home earlier than usual. Eleanor was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room, completely unaware of the storm waiting inside the house. She smiled when she saw him. "You're home early." Adrian placed the photographs on the table between them. Her smile slowly faded. She looked from the pictures to Adrian, immediately understanding what they appeared to suggest. "Would you like to explain this?" he asked. His voice remained calm, but the warmth she loved had disappeared. Eleanor picked up the photographs one by one. "I visited your father. I know that. He asked me to." "I know that too." Adrian folded his arms. "What I don't know is why none of these meetings were ever mentioned." Eleanor lowered her eyes for a brief moment. She remembered the promise she had made to his father. She remembered his failing health and the fear in his voice when he asked her to remain silent. "I can't tell you." Adrian looked at her as though he had misheard. "You can't." She slowly shook her head. "Not yet." Those two words hurt more than any accusation could have. Adrian had spent months convincing himself there was a reasonable explanation for every unanswered question. Hearing her refuse to answer shattered that hope. "Is there something happening behind my back?" he asked quietly. Eleanor's eyes filled with sadness. "Nothing that would ever hurt you. Then why keep it from me?" She struggled to find words that would honor both the promise she had made and the man standing before her, because sometimes protecting someone requires patience. Adrian's expression hardened. "Protection doesn't require lies." Eleanor looked directly into his eyes. "I have never lied to you." "No," Adrian replied. "You simply stopped telling me the truth." The room fell silent. Rain tapped gently against the windows, echoing through the enormous dining room. Eleanor wanted nothing more than to tell him everything. She wanted to place the sealed folder in his hands and explain every conversation she had shared with his father. But she had given her word, and she believed breaking that promise too soon would destroy something far greater than their marriage. Adrian stepped closer, his disappointment more painful than anger. "I trusted you more than anyone." Eleanor whispered, "You still can." He shook his head. "How?" She had no answer she was allowed to give. Adrian picked up the photographs again. "Every question I ask leads to another secret." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly before speaking. "Then hate the silence if you must. Just don't mistake it for betrayal." Adrian searched her face, hoping to find certainty somewhere behind her tears. Instead, he found only quiet determination. He realized she had already chosen to protect whatever secret she carried, even if it cost his trust. Hours later, after neither of them had touched dinner, Eleanor walked upstairs to their bedroom. She opened the closet, removed a small travel bag, then stopped. She wasn't packing to leave. She simply needed to remind herself how little she truly owned compared to everything she was about to lose. On the bedside table rested her wedding ring. She slipped it off only long enough to hold it in her hand, wondering whether promises could survive without trust. Downstairs, Adrian remained alone in the library. He replayed every conversation from the past year, every unexplained meeting, every unanswered question, every carefully chosen sentence Victor had spoken. None of it proved Eleanor had betrayed him, yet none of it allowed him to silence the doubt growing inside him. Just before midnight, his phone vibrated. A new email had arrived from an anonymous address. Attached was a scanned copy of what appeared to be a confidential financial agreement bearing Eleanor's signature beside Samuel Carter's. Across the top of the page, one line had been highlighted in red: "Transfer of controlling interest upon fulfillment of final condition." Adrian stared at the document as his pulse quickened. He had no way of knowing that the signature page had been skillfully altered. All he knew was that, for the first time since marrying Eleanor, the evidence in front of him seemed impossible to ignore, and upstairs, only one floor away, the woman he loved was quietly crying herself to sleep, without realizing that the final thread holding their marriage together had just begun to unravel. The following morning felt unnaturally calm, and somehow that frightened Eleanor more than another argument would have. Adrian left the house before sunrise without waking her, leaving only an untouched cup of coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter. For years, they had always found a way to say goodbye even on the busiest mornings. That day, silence took his place. Eleanor stood alone in the empty kitchen, her hands wrapped around the cold porcelain mug, realizing that the quiet between them no longer felt temporary, it felt permanent. Adrian spent the entire day surrounded by lawyers, financial advisors, and board members, but his attention never remained on the conversations in front of him. The anonymous agreement he had received the previous night stayed open on his laptop, its highlighted sentence repeating itself in his mind every time he tried to focus on something else. Samuel Carter examined the document briefly before returning it without expression. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Adrian answered honestly. "Someone sent it anonymously." Samuel looked at him carefully. Anonymous documents are rarely anonymous for a good reason. Adrian expected an explanation, perhaps even reassurance, but the attorney simply folded his hands. "I can't discuss confidential matters." Frustration flashed across Adrian's face. "Everyone keeps telling me they can't talk." Samuel held his gaze. "Sometimes the truth belongs to its proper moment." Adrian rose from his chair. "That sounds exactly like something Eleanor would say." Samuel's expression softened for the briefest instant. "Then perhaps you should consider why." But Adrian walked away before the older man could say another word. By late afternoon, he had convinced himself that avoiding the issue would only make everything worse. When he returned to the mansion, Eleanor was waiting in the library. She had already sensed that another conversation was coming, and this time she looked exhausted instead of hopeful. Adrian placed the anonymous agreement on the table between them. "Tell me this isn't real." Eleanor lowered her eyes to the document, immediately recognizing that several pages had been altered. The signature was hers, but the language surrounding it was not. Her heart sank. Someone had carefully woven truth and deception together. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly. "Answer my question first." She looked back at him. "It isn't what it appears to be." Adrian's shoulders stiffened. "Then explain it." Eleanor wanted nothing more than to reveal everything hidden inside the sealed folder entrusted to her by his father, but his final request echoed in her memory. Not until the right time she closed her eyes for a moment before whispering, "I can't." Adrian gave a slow, almost defeated nod. Again. The disappointment in that single word hurt more than any raised voice ever could. "Adrian," she began, taking one cautious step toward him. He stepped back instead. "Every time I ask for the truth, you ask for more patience." His voice remained calm, but the quiet control she knew so well had become colder than anger. "How much longer am I supposed to wait?" Eleanor could not answer. Tears gathered in her eyes, yet she refused to let them fall. She had promised herself long ago that she would never use tears to win an argument. "Please believe me," she said softly. "Everything I've done has been to protect you." Adrian let out a weary breath. "Do you know what hurts the most?" She remained silent. "I still want to believe you." Those words shattered something inside her. She realized then that his love had not disappeared. It was simply drowning beneath questions she was forbidden to answer. Adrian removed his wedding ring and placed it gently beside the forged agreement. There was no anger in the gesture, only heartbreak. "I don't know how to keep living inside a marriage built on secrets." Eleanor stared at the ring, unable to move. It was the same simple gold band they had chosen together because she believed love should never depend on wealth. Now it looked impossibly small against the polished wood of the table. "If this is what you want," she whispered, "I won't fight you." Adrian searched her face, almost expecting her to stop him, to reveal everything, to save what remained between them. Instead, she offered him only quiet acceptance. To Adrian, it felt like surrender. To Eleanor, it was the final sacrifice she believed she had to make. The divorce process moved forward with painful efficiency. Over the following weeks, there were no public scandals, no courtroom battles, and no arguments over money. Eleanor requested nothing except the freedom to leave with the belongings she had brought into the marriage. She refused every financial settlement Adrian offered. "You gave me enough," she told the attorney. "More than enough." Adrian signed every document placed before him, convincing himself that ending the marriage cleanly would allow them both to move on, yet every signature felt heavier than the last. The day the divorce became official, Eleanor quietly walked out of the Moretti estate carrying the same small leather suitcase she had packed years earlier when she first moved into the mansion. Several members of the household staff hugged her through tears. She thanked each of them by name before disappearing through the front gate. Adrian watched from the library window without allowing himself to step outside. By the time he finally reached the entrance, her taxi had already vanished beyond the trees. Days turned into weeks. The mansion became unbearably silent. Fresh flowers no longer appeared in the dining room. Music no longer drifted from the piano after dinner. Adrian buried himself in work, hoping exhaustion would quiet his thoughts. But every corner of the house reminded him of Eleanor's presence. Then another loss arrived. Margaret Hayes, Eleanor's adoptive mother, passed away after a brief illness. Adrian learned about her death from a short newspaper notice. He considered attending the funeral, but convinced himself he no longer had the right. Unknown to him, Eleanor stood beside her mother's grave, believing she had buried not only the woman who raised her, but the last chapter of the life she once dreamed of sharing with Adrian. 3 days after the funeral, Samuel Carter called Adrian personally. His voice sounded more solemn than ever. "There's one final matter regarding your father's estate," he said. Adrian rubbed his tired eyes. "I thought everything had already been settled." "Not everything. What is it?" A brief silence followed. "Your father left specific instructions that could only be carried out after 2 conditions were met." Adrian frowned. "What conditions?" Samuel answered quietly. "After Margaret Hayes had passed away, and after Eleanor was no longer your wife." Adrian felt the room grow strangely cold around him. He looked toward the empty chair where Eleanor used to sit with a book every evening, his heartbeat suddenly louder than the silence surrounding him. "Come to my office tomorrow morning," Samuel continued. "It's time for you to learn why your father believed the truth had to wait until you had already lost the woman you loved." Adrian barely slept that night. Samuel Carter's final words echoed through the empty mansion long after the call had ended, refusing to leave his thoughts. By sunrise, he was already standing outside the attorney's office, arriving nearly half an hour earlier than the appointed time. The receptionist seemed surprised to see him so restless. Adrian Moretti was known as a man who never hurried, never showed uncertainty, and never allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. That morning, however, he looked like someone carrying a question too heavy to postpone another minute. When Samuel finally invited him inside, the elderly attorney did not begin with legal language or formal greetings. Instead, he unlocked an old wooden cabinet built into the wall and carefully removed a weathered archive box, sealed with the Moretti family crest. He carried it to the desk with unusual care before placing it between them. "Everything inside belongs to you now," he said quietly. Adrian looked at the box without touching it. "Is this what my father wanted me to see?" Samuel nodded. "Only after Eleanor was no longer your wife." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Why?" The attorney folded his hands. "Because he believed you would never truly understand the cost of her silence while you still had the comfort of her presence." Those words struck Adrian harder than he expected. Samuel slid a small brass key across the desk. "Open it." Adrian unlocked the box and slowly lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was not money, contracts, or family records. It was a bundle of neatly tied handwritten letters, each one addressed in his father's unmistakable handwriting to Eleanor. Beneath them rested medical reports, financial documents, photographs, and a leather journal worn smooth with age. Confused, Adrian picked up the top letter. The envelope had already been opened years earlier. Inside, his father's handwriting filled every page. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I no longer have enough strength to protect Adrian myself. You once asked why I trusted you so quickly. The answer is simple. You are the first person who ever loved my son without wanting anything from his name." Adrian stopped reading for a moment. His throat tightened unexpectedly. He had spent months believing Eleanor had hidden things from him for selfish reasons. Instead, the very first sentence praised her devotion. He continued, "There are people inside this family who will mistake kindness for weakness. They will try to divide you from Adrian because they know his greatest strength has become his love for you. If that day comes, I ask something impossible. Protect him, even if he misunderstands you. Some truths cannot be revealed until the evidence is complete. If spoken too early, they will only place him in greater danger." Adrian lowered the letter slowly. "Danger," he whispered. Samuel gave a small nod. "Your father had been investigating financial fraud inside the family organization during the final year of his life." Adrian looked up sharply. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Because he wasn't certain whom he could trust." The answer landed like a blow. Samuel reached into the box and removed several folders. He feared information was leaking from inside the executive offices. Every time he gathered evidence, someone destroyed part of it before he could act. Adrian stared at the documents spread across the desk, and Eleanor knew. "Not everything," Samuel replied. "Only enough to help him preserve the evidence until it could no longer be altered." Adrian's breathing slowed as memory after memory returned. Every unexplained visit, every quiet meeting, every secret conversation with his father. None of them had been betrayals. They had been part of something he had never imagined. Samuel handed him another document. "Recognize this." Adrian immediately froze. It was the same financial agreement that had convinced him Eleanor was hiding something. Only this version was complete. The highlighted sentence from the anonymous email was still there, but the following pages, missing from the forged copy, completely changed its meaning. Rather than transferring control away from Adrian, the agreement created legal safeguards preventing any family member from claiming authority without unanimous approval from independent trustees. Eleanor's signature had authorized those protections at his father's request. The forged version had deliberately removed every page, proving that fact. Adrian closed his eyes. Someone wanted me to believe she was taking control. Exactly. Samuel opened another folder containing forensic reports completed only weeks earlier. Independent handwriting specialists had confirmed that several signatures on the anonymous documents had been digitally manipulated before being printed. Adrian felt the blood drain from his face. "Who sent them?" Samuel answered carefully. "We couldn't prove it then." He slid one final report across the desk. "Now we can." Adrian read the first page in silence. A private investigation commissioned by his father shortly before his death had traced unauthorized financial access, altered records, and anonymous communications to accounts controlled by Victor Moretti through a network of shell companies. The evidence was incomplete while Adrian's father was alive. Over the past year, additional records quietly collected by outside investigators had finally completed the chain. Adrian looked up slowly. "Victor?" Samuel nodded once. "Your father suspected him long before anyone else did." Adrian leaned back, struggling to process everything he was learning. Every doubt Victor had planted now appeared painfully deliberate. Every anonymous message, every carefully timed observation, every innocent-sounding question, they had all served one purpose: separating Adrian from the one person standing between Victor and complete control of the family's future. Samuel then reached into the bottom of the archive box and carefully lifted out a small leather notebook. This belonged to Eleanor. Adrian accepted it with trembling hands. The first page contained nothing except a date and one sentence written in her familiar handwriting. "If loving him means carrying his anger, then I will carry it until the truth can stand on its own." Adrian swallowed hard before turning another page. There were no complaints, no accusations. Instead, Eleanor had recorded every meeting with his father, every document she protected, every legal step taken to preserve evidence, and every conversation in which she worried that Adrian would misunderstand her silence. One entry stopped Adrian completely. "Today," Adrian asked, "why I looked so tired." I wanted to tell him everything. I almost did. But his father looked at me with tears in his eyes and reminded me that one careless conversation could destroy months of evidence. I don't know whether I'm saving my husband's future or losing my marriage. Maybe both. Adrian closed the journal as emotion finally broke through the walls he had spent years building. For the first time since Eleanor walked away, he understood that every unanswered question had cost her just as much as it had cost him. She had not chosen secrecy over love. She had chosen love at the cost of being misunderstood. Samuel quietly placed one final sealed envelope on the desk. Unlike the others, this one bore Eleanor's handwriting across the front. "For Adrian, only after he knows the truth." Adrian stared at her name written in graceful blue ink, suddenly realizing that everything he had learned so far was only the beginning. Whatever waited inside Eleanor's final letter was important enough that she had trusted it to the future instead of to the man she loved, and for the first time in months, Adrian found himself terrified of what her own words were about to reveal. Adrian held the envelope in both hands for several long seconds before breaking the seal. The familiar curve of Eleanor's handwriting across the front was enough to make his chest tighten. She had written his name so many times over the years, inside birthday cards, on little notes tucked into his briefcase, across the first page of every novel she gave him. But this felt different. This was not a note meant to brighten his day. It was a goodbye she had hoped he would never have to read. He unfolded the pages carefully, almost afraid that moving too quickly might somehow erase the last words she had left behind. "My dearest Adrian T," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then Samuel has decided you finally know enough to understand why I stayed silent. I prayed every day that this letter would never become necessary because that would have meant we found another way. I am so sorry that we didn't." Adrian lowered his head, unable to continue for a moment. Eleanor had apologized before explaining anything. Even now she was thinking about his pain before her own. He forced himself to keep reading. "You once promised that we would never stop telling each other the truth. I broke that promise, and I have lived with the weight of it every day. I know how my honesty meant to you. I know." The silence slowly changed the way you looked at me. Every time you asked another question, I wanted to tell you everything. More than once, I almost did. But your father asked me to protect something that could not survive if the wrong people learned what we knew too soon. Adrian's vision blurred as he remembered every conversation in which Eleanor had quietly whispered, "Please believe me." She had never asked him to ignore the truth. She had only begged him to trust her until the truth was safe. He had failed to understand the difference. The next page revealed the burden she had carried alone. Your father discovered that someone inside the family was stealing more than money. Confidential records were disappearing. Loyal employees who questioned certain financial decisions were quietly dismissed. Witnesses became frightened. Documents vanished before investigators could secure them. He believed the person responsible was watching every move made inside the company. If either of us confronted the wrong person too early, years of evidence would disappear forever. Adrian closed his eyes. Every strange delay, every unexplained meeting, every confidential conversation suddenly fit together with painful clarity. Eleanor continued. He believed the safest place for the evidence was with someone no one would suspect. Not his lawyers, not his executives, not even you. He chose me because I loved you before I understood your family name, and because he trusted I would protect your future, even if it destroyed my happiness. Adrian felt his hands begin to tremble. His father had entrusted the future of the family to Eleanor, not because she was convenient, but because she was honorable. She had accepted a responsibility that had slowly cost her everything. The letter continued. I knew people would eventually notice my meetings with your father. I knew questions would come. At first I believed I could simply tell you the truth once the investigation ended. But your father's condition worsened, and he made me promise that nothing would be revealed until every piece of evidence had been secured through legal channels. He was afraid that if you confronted anyone too soon, they would destroy what remained and convince you that he had imagined everything. He asked me to trust the process. I agreed because I trusted him, and because I loved you enough to believe we could survive a little longer. I was wrong. Adrian remembered the night he had accused Eleanor of choosing secrets over their marriage. He remembered the disappointment in her eyes when he stepped away instead of toward her. Until that moment, he had believed she was protecting herself. Now he understood she had been protecting him. Tears rolled silently down his face as he reached the next page. There is something else you deserve to know. During the final months of your father's life, he often worried that you had inherited his greatest weakness, not his pride, his habit of carrying every burden alone. He told me that one day you would believe you were protecting the people you loved by keeping your fears hidden. He was afraid that silence would become a family tradition. I promised him I would never let that happen. I failed him too. Instead of breaking the cycle, I became part of it. Adrian covered his eyes with one hand. The irony was unbearable. Both of them had chosen silence for what they believed were loving reasons, and together they had built the very misunderstanding that destroyed their marriage. Eleanor's final pages no longer spoke about the investigation. They spoke only about him. If you feel guilty after reading this, please don't waste your life punishing yourself. Regret can teach us, but it should never become the home we live in. I have never blamed you for asking questions. I only wished I had been free to answer them. I know you believed the documents placed before you. I know you thought you were making the only decision left. Love cannot survive forever without trust, and I understand why yours began to disappear. Even on the day I signed the divorce papers, I never stopped loving you. I simply accepted that protecting you might cost me the future I dreamed about. Adrian could barely breathe. He reached the last page with shaking fingers. By the time you finish this letter, the investigation should finally be complete. If justice has been done, then my promise to your father was not meaningless. I don't know where life will take me after this. Maybe we will never meet again. Maybe that's for the best. But if you remember anything about me, please remember this. I never walked away because I stopped loving you. I walked away because loving you was the one promise I refused to break. Live a life your father would be proud of. Learn to trust your heart before your fears. And if someday you think of me, don't remember the woman who left. Remember the young teacher who smiled at you in that little library and believed that even the loneliest man deserved a happy ending. With all the love I was never able to stop giving you, Eleanor. The room remained completely silent. After Adrian lowered the final page, he did not speak. He could not. Every memory he had carried over the past year had been rewritten by the truth contained inside her words. He remembered the coffee she placed beside him during long nights, the notes hidden inside his briefcase, the patience she offered when he gave almost nothing in return, and the heartbreaking calm with which she accepted the divorce because she believed keeping one promise mattered more than defending herself. Samuel quietly placed a hand on Adrian's shoulder but said nothing. There were no words capable of easing this kind of regret. After several minutes, Adrian carefully folded the letter along the original creases and slipped it back into its envelope as though it were the most precious thing he had ever held. Then he looked at Samuel with eyes that no longer held confusion, only devastating clarity. "Where is she?" he asked. Samuel hesitated before answering. "No one knows for certain. She left the city the morning after Margaret's funeral. She asked that no one follow her." Adrian rose to his feet without another word, but before he reached the office door, Samuel's quiet voice stopped him. "Adrian, finding Eleanor may be the easiest part. The harder question is whether the woman you let go still has a place in her heart for the man who didn't believe her." Adrian left Samuel Carter's office carrying only Eleanor's letter, yet it felt heavier than every responsibility he had ever accepted in his life. For months he had believed he was searching for evidence against the woman he loved. Now the evidence demanded that he confront the man he had trusted instead. By the time he arrived at Moretti headquarters, the morning board meeting was already underway. Victor stood confidently at the front of the room, presenting quarterly reports, greeting Adrian with the same practiced smile that had fooled everyone for years. "You're just in time," Victor said warmly. "We were about to discuss next year's expansion." Adrian walked to the head of the table without answering. He placed a thick folder in front of him, then looked slowly around the room. Every executive fell silent. They immediately sensed something had changed. Adrian spoke calmly, the way he always did before making an important decision. "Before we discuss the future, we're going to settle the past." Victor's smile faded almost imperceptibly. "Is something wrong?" Adrian slid several documents across the polished table. "I'd like everyone to examine these." The board members began reading in silence. The first pages contained the original financial agreements preserved by Adrian's father. The next pages displayed the altered versions that had been anonymously delivered months earlier. Detailed forensic reports explained exactly how the documents had been manipulated. Independent investigators had traced the digital alterations to devices purchased through companies secretly controlled by Victor. One executive looked up in disbelief. Another quietly removed his glasses and reread the report from the beginning. Victor remained composed, though the confidence in his eyes had begun to crack. "You can't seriously believe these accusations," he said with a nervous laugh. "Anyone could fabricate a report." Adrian calmly opened another folder. These records came from 3 independent forensic firms, 2 outside auditing companies, and the investigators my father hired before he died. He placed bank records beside them. "These transfers connect shell companies directly to accounts you controlled." Victor's expression hardened, circumstantial. Adrian nodded once. "I thought you might say that." He pressed a button on the conference table. The large screen behind him came to life, displaying security footage recovered from an off-site archive that Adrian's father had arranged to preserve automatically. The recording showed Victor entering a restricted records room late one evening, months before Adrian's father passed away. Minutes later, he left carrying confidential files that had officially been reported missing the following morning. Victor stared at the screen without speaking. Adrian switched to another recording. This one captured Victor meeting privately with the consultant responsible for preparing several financial summaries later proven to have been altered. The consultant had already admitted to accepting payment in exchange for modifying documents before disappearing overseas. Signed testimony now rested inside the folder before every board member. The silence inside the room became suffocating. Finally, one elderly director looked directly at Victor. "Is any of this untrue?" Victor looked around the table, searching for support, but found only stunned faces. For the first time in years, charm offered him no protection. He slowly rose from his chair. "Do you really think I did all of this for money?" Adrian answered quietly. "No." Victor gave a bitter smile. "I did it because everything was always yours. The company, the respect, uncle's approval." His voice grew sharper with every sentence. "I worked just as hard, but no matter what I accomplished, I was always standing behind Adrian Moretti." Several board members exchanged uneasy glances as years of resentment finally surfaced. Victor laughed bitterly. Then she arrived. He did not say Eleanor's name. He didn't have to. Suddenly, even your father trusted her more than he trusted family. She walked into our lives and became the person everyone admired. Adrian felt his hands tighten beneath the table, but he remained silent. Victor shook his head. "I only needed the two of you to stop trusting each other. After that, everything else happened exactly as I expected." The confession hung heavily over the room. No one interrupted him. No one defended him. Adrian reached into his briefcase and removed one final item. It was Eleanor's wedding ring, the simple gold band she had left beside the divorce papers. He placed it gently on the table. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Adrian asked quietly. Victor frowned. Adrian looked directly into his cousin's eyes. "You never actually defeated Eleanor." Victor's expression shifted. "What?" Adrian's voice remained steady. "She kept every promise she made. She protected my father's investigation. She protected the company. She protected innocent employees whose jobs you intended to destroy. The only person she couldn't protect," he paused, his eyes lowering to the ring, "was herself." No one spoke. Adrian continued. "I accused the wrong person because I chose fear over trust. That failure belongs to me. What belongs to you is everything else." He closed the folder. "Effective immediately, your position within this company is terminated. Every document gathered here has already been submitted to federal investigators and financial crime prosecutors. Civil proceedings have begun to recover every asset obtained through fraud. You will answer for your actions in court, not in this boardroom." Victor looked around desperately, hoping someone might object, but the directors quietly nodded in agreement. One by one, they signed the emergency resolution removing him from every position he held within the organization. Security officers entered only after the final signature had been placed on the document. They approached respectfully, giving Victor an opportunity to leave with dignity rather than force. He hesitated near the doorway before turning back toward Adrian. "After everything I've done, you still won't hate me the way you hate yourself." Adrian met his gaze without anger. "You're wrong." Victor waited. Adrian looked once more at Eleanor's ring resting on the polished wood. "I don't hate myself anymore." Victor frowned. Adrian continued softly. "I finally understand what she wanted me to learn. Regret is supposed to change us, not imprison us." Without another word, Victor lowered his head and walked out between the security officers. The conference room remained silent until the doors closed behind him. Hours later, Adrian stood before the entire company. Employees filled the atrium while executives lined the balconies above. For the first time in his career, Adrian abandoned every prepared speech. He spoke from memory instead. He explained that internal corruption had been uncovered, that those responsible would face justice through the legal system, and that every employee harmed by the fraud would receive full restitution. Then he stopped, took a slow breath, and said something no one expected to hear from the powerful man standing before them. "There is one more apology I owe. A woman who served this family with honesty and courage had her integrity questioned because I failed to trust the person who deserved my faith the most. Eleanor Hayes acted only to protect this company, my late father, and all of us. Every accusation made against her was false. Today I publicly restore the honor she never lost." The atrium remained completely still before quiet applause began somewhere near the back of the crowd. It spread slowly until the entire room was filled with grateful hands and tearful faces. Adrian accepted none of it as forgiveness. He knew justice had finally been served, but justice alone could not repair a broken heart. That evening, after the building had emptied, Samuel Carter walked into Adrian's office carrying a small envelope that had arrived with no return address. Inside was a single postcard showing a peaceful lighthouse overlooking the ocean. There was no signature, only 6 handwritten words Adrian recognized instantly. I heard the truth finally won. The postcard remained on Adrian's desk for 3 days before he finally allowed himself to follow its quiet invitation. There was no address, only the name of a small coastal town printed beneath the image of an old lighthouse. Samuel Carter had already confirmed that the postcard had been mailed from there, but he offered no further help. Some journeys, he said gently, must be completed without shortcuts. Adrian understood. For the first time in years, he chose not to send assistants, security teams, or private investigators. If Eleanor wished to remain hidden, he would respect that. He packed a small overnight bag, slipped her letter into the inside pocket of his coat, and drove alone along the winding highway that followed the coastline. The farther he traveled from the city, the quieter his thoughts became. He no longer rehearsed apologies. He no longer imagined perfect words capable of repairing everything he had broken. Eleanor had already taught him that love could not be restored by promises alone. It had to be rebuilt through truth, patience, and consistent actions. The lighthouse appeared just before sunset, standing on a rocky cliff above the ocean exactly as it had in the postcard. Nearby, children laughed in the schoolyard of a small community center. Adrian parked across the street and remained inside the car for several minutes, watching families leave the building. Then he saw her. Eleanor stepped through the front doors carrying a stack of well-worn novels, smiling as 2 little girls proudly showed her drawings they had made during class. She looked different, yet wonderfully familiar. Her hair was slightly shorter. The sadness that had once rested quietly behind her eyes had softened into something gentler. She thanked the children, waved goodbye to their parents, and turned toward the path leading to a modest cottage overlooking the sea. Adrian stepped out of the car, gravel crunched beneath his shoes. Eleanor looked up. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The ocean breeze carried silence between them, but it no longer felt like the silence that had destroyed their marriage. This silence was careful, uncertain, and honest. Eleanor was the first to speak. "You found me." Adrian nodded. "I wasn't sure I deserved to." She studied his face for several seconds. The confidence that had once defined him had been replaced by humility. "Why are you here?" she asked softly. Adrian reached into his coat and removed the simple gold wedding ring she had left behind. Months earlier, he held it in his open palm instead of offering it to her. "Not to ask you to come back." Eleanor's eyes rested on the ring before returning to his face. "Then why?" He took a slow breath. "Because I spent too long believing that being right mattered more than listening. I came to tell you something I should have said the day you asked me to trust you." Adrian looked toward the waves before continuing. "I was wrong." There was no excuse attached to the confession. No explanation. No attempt to lessen his responsibility. Only the truth. "I believed fear more easily than I believed the woman who loved me." His voice trembled slightly. "You deserved better than the husband I became." Eleanor lowered her eyes. Months earlier, she had imagined this conversation countless times. Yet now that it had arrived, none of the words she had prepared seemed important anymore. Adrian carefully returned the ring to his pocket. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," he smiled sadly. "Maybe not tomorrow either." Eleanor looked at him again. "Then what are you asking?" Adrian answered with complete honesty. "A chance to earn your trust the way you spent years earning mine." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, but she did not look away. "Do you know what hurt the most?" she whispered. Adrian slowly shook his head. "It wasn't the divorce," she paused, searching for words. "It was watching the man I loved stop recognizing the person standing in front of him." Adrian felt those words settle deep inside his heart. "I know," he said quietly. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I never lose sight of the people I love again." The evening light painted the ocean in shades of gold as they stood facing one another. Neither hurried to close the distance between them. Some wounds healed slowly, and both of them finally understood that rushing would only reopen what had barely begun to mend. Eleanor invited him to walk with her toward the lighthouse. They spoke about simple things at first. The children she now taught, the small library she had helped rebuild, the garden behind her cottage where she grew lavender, because it reminded her that difficult seasons always ended eventually. Adrian listened more than he spoke. When she mentioned Margaret, He quietly apologized for missing the funeral. Eleanor nodded with understanding. "She knew you loved me," she said. "She never doubted that. She only wished we had trusted each other sooner." They reached a large oak tree overlooking the water, its branches stretching toward the evening sky. Adrian stopped walking. "Do you remember this place?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "How could I forget? Years earlier, during one of their first trips together, they had stood beneath a tree just like this one, while Adrian admitted he had spent most of his life believing strength meant carrying every burden alone. Eleanor had taken his hand and told him that real strength was allowing someone else to help carry the weight. They had promised never to let silence speak louder than love. Adrian looked at her with quiet gratitude. "I broke that promise." Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the postcard she had mailed weeks earlier. On the back, beneath the 6 words Adrian had already read, she had written another sentence he had never seen because the ink had been hidden beneath the stamp. She handed it to him. "If you come with the truth." "Nothing else," Adrian smiled through tears. "I finally did." Eleanor looked out across the endless horizon before gently slipping her hand into his. It was not the passionate embrace of young lovers, nor the dramatic reunion of fairy tales. It was something stronger. It was a choice, a quiet decision to begin again without pretending the past had never happened. They stood together watching the sun disappear beyond the ocean, knowing forgiveness would continue growing day by day, just as trust once had. Months later, the Moretti Foundation opened a new community library in Margaret Hayes' memory. Eleanor directed the literacy program. Adrian rarely appeared at public ceremonies anymore, preferring instead to sit in the children's reading corner, while Eleanor shared stories that reminded young hearts to choose kindness over fear. Above the entrance to the library hung a simple wooden plaque bearing a single sentence that neither of them had written, yet both knew by heart. "The strongest hearts are not the ones that never break, but the ones brave enough to love again after they do." And every time Adrian passed those words, he remembered that power had built his fortune, truth had restored his honor, but love, patient, quiet, and unwavering, had finally led him home.